Hi, everyone. We went through in class today a little bit of the history of Darwin, and we mentioned that Darwin observed a lot of variation among species, a lot of differences among species. He felt that species changed over time, and he really wanted to know, how is it that species change over time? Or another way of saying it is, how does evolution happen? And Darwin, as we mentioned, was influenced by different thinkers. And he ultimately came up with his theory of evolution that is called the theory of natural selection. So what we're going to talk about today are the 4 parts of the theory of natural selection. And what I would like you to do as you're listening is I'll let you know when we get to each part. And then I want you to write a 2 to 3 sentence summary of each part of his theory. So we'll have 4 parts and you'll write 2 to 3 sentences of each. So in front of you, you see 2 rabbits. And you notice they're both rabbits, but they're different. One has long ears, one has shorter ears, one is fatter, one is skinnier, one has white fur, one has brown fur. Now, these things are not all the result of gene expression in the environment. Rather, these could possibly be the result of evolution. So Darwin would want to explain to us, how is it that a rabbit living in the desert turns brown while other rabbits stay white? And we'll try to understand that. So the first part of the theory of natural selection is based on the principle of overproduction. And this idea Darwin got from Thomas Malthus. So if you look at this pepper seeds, you'll notice that the pepper has hundreds of seeds inside of it. And you could imagine that if every pepper seed found in a pepper developed into actual peppers, our world would be overrun by peppers. Now, why is it that not every single pepper seed turns into a pepper? Well, that's because there's not enough resources for there to be a million bajillion peppers in the world. There's simply not enough food and space for them. So as a result, only the organisms that are best suited to their environment could actually survive. So let's go through that again. Overproduction first says that populations produce more offspring than can survive. Not every living thing that is ever born will be able to live. Why won't every living thing be able to live? That is because there are limited natural resources. There is not enough food, water, space for all living things to survive. Step 2 is the struggle for existence. Since there isn't enough resources for all living things to survive, members of a population have to compete to see which organisms will be able to get the resources. So when we say they're competing, they're not competing to look the best or be the strongest or tallest. They're competing to be able to get access to the resources. The plant that has space and sunlight will live. The plant that doesn't will not live. The rabbit that can access the grass and have a habitat will live. The rabbit that can't access the grass won't. So saying it again, the struggle for existence is that members of a population must compete to obtain food, living space, and other necessities of life. The next part of our theory has to do with variations and adaptations. So we mentioned in class that there are variations among organisms. There's naturally differences among organisms. So a variation is a naturally occurring difference in a species. For example, some rabbits are born with brown fur, and some rabbits are born with white fur. Depending on the environment in which an animal lives, those variations may or may not be helpful to them. So an adaptation is a trait that makes an organism well suited to its particular environment. So if I am a rabbit with brown fur living in a desert, then it's great for me that I have brown fur, and that's a positive adaptation. If, however, I'm a white rabbit living in the desert, that's not going to help me. And if I have brown fur and I'm living in a snowy area, then my adaptation that was positive in the desert is not going to be positive in the North Pole. So another way of defining an adaptation is saying any heritable characteristic, any characteristic that can be inherited, that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment. So if I am a brown rabbit and I live in the desert, having that trait makes me more likely to be able to be camouflaged if I can be camouflaged, chances are I'll live. And if I live, hopefully I'll reproduce and pass that trait on to my offspring. What's important to understand about Darwin's understanding of variations is that Darwin understood that variations happen naturally. Organisms are just born looking differently. He didn't know about genes. He didn't understand recombination and mutations. But he also wasn't like Lamarck. Lamarck said, in order for an organism to become different, it has to make itself different. Darwin said, no way, that doesn't make sense. Organisms are different because they're born different. If the trait that you're born with happens to make you more likely to survive, then that's a positive adaptation, and that will be passed on to your children. So what we have here is a couple of examples of plant and animal adaptations. Camouflage, if you blend in, organisms won't see you. Horns can help an animal defend itself. Claws help an animal obtain its food. I'm sure you guys know a lot, can all think of different examples of traits that help animals survive. If we get to the last part of Darwin's theory, we're up to the concept of survival of the fittest. So let's go back for a minute. We said that there's overproduction. There's not enough food and other resources for all organisms to survive. Then we said that there's a struggle for existence. Since there isn't enough resources, organisms will struggle to be the ones to get the resources. But then we said certain organisms will be born with an adaptation that makes them more likely to be able to get those resources and to be able to survive. And what we end with is survival of the fittest, which is basically saying not survival of the strongest, not survival of the biggest, rather survival of the organism that fits best with its environment. Fit individuals are well suited to their environment. As a result, they can survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits to their offspring. So the better you fit in with your environment, the better suited your traits make you to your environment, the more likely you will be to pass on your traits. And it's important to remember that survival is not only about staying alive, it's about reproducing and passing on those traits to the next generation. So we talked about the giraffe example in class, and we spoke about Lamarck's explanation of giraffes. Darwin would explain long necks in giraffes differently. He would say, there are more giraffes produced than can actually survive. And there's limited food for them. Not all of the giraffes will be able to survive because there's just not enough food for them. Now let's imagine that where the giraffes live, there's trees of different heights. And then Darwin will say, okay, giraffes will be born with different length necks. What he would then explain is that the giraffes with the long necks are going to be more fit or have better adaptations to help them survive. The giraffe with a long neck will be able to get the resources. Since the giraffe with a long neck can get the food, it will live, and it will reproduce, and it will pass its genes of long neck to the next kids, to the next generation. And eventually, over time, only giraffes with long necks would be left, and then we'd say, okay, this species evolved from having many different types of neck lengths to only having long necks. We'll skip these for now and come back to them in class. But here's another summary that I'm not going to read to you, but you can pause and read this over on your own. Thanks, and have a good night.